Both President Trump and James Comey this morning claiming vindication after a 61-page report from the Justice Department's internal watchdog sharply criticized the former FBI director's handling and release of memos detailing his interactions with the president. The inspector general says that Comey's goal in disclosing one of the memos, seeking an appointment of a special counsel to investigate Trump and his aides, did not justify the violations. But the report also found that Comey never released any classified information to the public, and so Comey will not face prosecution. But the president isn't dropping it, tweeting twice in less than an hour, including writing, "The disastrous IG report on James Comey shows in the strongest of terms how unfairly I and tens of millions of great people who support me were treated," and calling Comey a dishonest fool. Joining me now, former U.S. Attorney and former Assistant Director for the Office of Congressional Affairs at the FBI, Greg Brower, and former federal prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner. Perfect gentleman to have with us this morning. Greg, you worked directly with James Comey. In the tweets over the last hour, the president also said that what this report shows is that AG Barr is fair and reasonable. It also shows that he did some stuff wrong. How do you read it?
Well, I read the report as documenting the fact that this FBI director found himself in an unprecedented situation. He thought he had been a witness to potentially criminal conduct on the part of the president. He created memos to memorialize those conversations with the president. As it turns out, the IG report finds that Director Comey didn't handle those memos in exactly the right way under DOJ and FBI policies. The IG, in so finding, was simply doing its job. But what the IG also found was that Director Comey did not intentionally violate those policies, did not break the law, and did not lie about any of this. And so not much in there is surprising, frankly, to most people. I think that the focus really should be back on the substance of these memos and not the process foul that the OIG found.
I guess the other side of this, Glenn, clearly is that what does this say to the FBI going forward? Because what the IG found is that the argument that Comey made that these were exceptional circumstances and so it warranted the leak given the stakes just isn't so.
Yeah, I largely agree with Greg, Chris. I think there are two important takeaways. I think one of the main points is that the ends don't justify the means. And that's a message that the IG was pretty clear on in the last 10 pages of his report. And I think the IG wanted to send a signal to all government officials that even if you think it's really important that you get information out, and what could be more important than a president who is potentially engaged in criminal obstruction of justice, you still need to follow the rules and procedures. The other thing, Chris, that I think we should pay attention to here is that the president's statements and tweets can't be credited when you read the IG's report, because how many times did he tell us James Comey leaked classified information?
At least
James
10 by the Washington Post count.
James Comey is a criminal. And what did we learn from the IG's report? Those things are untrue. So the president can try to play cleanup in his more recent tweets, but let's remember his statements and his tweets are inaccurate, untrue, and can't be credited because Comey didn't leak any classified information, and he didn't commit any crimes.
Yeah, and so it's sort of touched off this mini Twitter war. On one side, you have Trump tweeting, and this was from yesterday, although, again, he's tweeted on this a couple of times today. Perhaps never in the history of our country has someone been more thoroughly disgraced and excoriated than James Comey. But then Comey responded, "I don't need a public apology from those who defamed me, but a quick message with a sorry we lied about you would be nice." Greg, is either of them really vindicated by this report?
Well, I think this is a great example of how litigating these issues by way of Twitter really is not productive. There's no winner, especially
on
when
either
it comes
side, right?
Well, that's true. And trying to go up against this president in a Twitter war is a losing proposition. And so it's probably just not productive. But I think Director Comey is in large part vindicated in the fact that, again, when confronted with an unprecedented situation, he did what he thought was right. That turned out to not be in conformance with DOJ and FBI policy. But again, no finding of leaking any classified information, of breaking the law, or even of intentionally violating department policy. He simply had, no good choices. He chose to preserve the evidence in the way that he thought made sense at the time, and it turns out the OIG disagreed with the details of that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.